So, quick background. I come from a military family, and as such, I live all over the country, often unable to keep friends for any period. I also have insane social anxiety, so I'm overall pretty bad at making friends to start. This story starts after I lived in rural Newfoundland for about 3 years, at age 14. I have no friends, my home life is pretty terrible, and I was at this point pretty depressed. I lived on about an acre of land with a river separating us from about 1 million acres of raw forest that had a bunch of ATV trails on it. It was a spooky ass forest, and I have a shit ton of stories about what I saw in there that make most horror movies look like a joke. Of note is the Bear Trap Forest, the 40-foot swamp, the random abandoned suburb, and the house in the middle of nowhere. But those are stories for another time. It was around late August. My parents had told me that for many weeks now there had been hoots and hollers coming from our backyard. They had seen flashlights and thought it was some shit kids just trying to break into our garage and steal some beer. There had been times I heard it too, normally in the evening, of just a couple of voices periodically hollering, and often I heard several voices speaking from just across the river in the woods. No big deal. A lot of kids hung out in those woods, and due to my oppressive social anxiety, I sure didn't have any desire to talk to them. After this had happened for some weeks, I heard the kids doing their usual thing around 4 in the afternoon and decided, fuck it, I'm gonna go see what's so amusing. So I venture into the woods and go maybe about 300 feet on an ATV trail my neighbor used, and I meet one of them. I'm going to use their names as maybe it will give some context to someone. The kid I met was named Jack. He was a year or two younger than me, about a foot shorter, and wearing some really out-of-date clothes. He seemed kind of surprised to meet me, but we said our hellos. I said I had heard them for a while now and came to see what was happening. Jack got super pumped and insisted I follow him to his friend's project. So I follow the guy, and I'm brought into an area that is pretty clear-cut in a dense path of woods. I knew this area. I hung out in the woods alone a lot and explored, and this was brand new. There were two other kids there, one my age named Elvis, and another older kid by about 2 years named Louis. They said they were working on a tree house, a fort, and wondered if I was interested in helping. I, of course, said yes, as I had never been asked to hang out with anyone, and they showed me around. Now I need to discuss these kids' clothes. When I say out of style, I'm talking early 80s miserable fashion. Neon colors, one kid had shoulder pads. It was a mess. Plus, they wore big rubber boots, and the kids looked, I want to say, new. Like they had no signs of pimples. Their hair was immaculate, clothes crisp as hell. I had just assumed that they had hand-me-downs from their parents or something. They stated that they were all friends, not brothers. So these kids were nice to me. I mean, really nice. I never really got to know them. They never wanted to talk about their home life, but that isn't surprising where I lived. We used hatchets, saws, ropes, and nails, and made a pretty solid fort. I had about 8-foot walls made of birch trees. We made a table to sit at, a lookout post, and the biggest tree we could find. The place was about the size of a one-bedroom apartment, and we were all around pretty proud. One day we were sitting at the table talking about our favorite trees or something, and I asked Elvis why I had never seen him around before. If he lived near me, he had to go to my school. It was one of two schools in the town, and no way he lived in the catchment area of the other one. He insisted he did, and wondered why he never met me either. We didn't know the same classmates. Same people could barely agree on teachers. But whatever, these kids talked to me and that was enough. So about 2 weeks after meeting them and building this fort, I said I needed to go home and get something to eat. I asked if they wanted something too, as this was basically my backyard and my parents always made too much food. They became downright hostile. Not over the food, they just refused to cross the river. Adamantly. Lewis came up with a story about how crossing a stranger's river is bad luck, but I sure wasn't pushing the issue. I asked if they wanted something, and they said yes, and I brought back a pie we could all eat. They apologized about getting angry, said they were very superstitious, and I thought nothing more of it. We had a good rest of the day, planning to invade the woods looking for some thick pine trees. Cut to about a week later. I had gone into the fort, and we did our thing. But today the kids look haggard. Jack was particularly bad. He looked like he had just gotten the beat down of his life while catching pneumonia 3 times over. I asked if he was okay, and he said yeah, it was just the flu, but they also looked wet. Maybe greasy is a better word. They had sick hair. Their skin was all shiny and clammy, and their clothes looked like ass. I wasn't shocked. These kids wore the same clothes every day, but so did a lot of the really poor kids in the town. We played around for an hour or so before they left, with Lewis saying that he will see me tomorrow, as Jack and Elvis walked away coughing like they smoked a pack a day. I had told my parents about these kids, and they thought the kids were weird, but a kid with no friends just found 3, don't ask questions. The nighttime hollering had stopped at this point, and we never did see the flashlights again. So the next day I went back with a hatchet and bag of nails in hand, as the plan was we were going to give the lookout a roof. When I come to the fort, the place is wrecked. The walls have been torn down, the table was in half, and the lookout had maybe 1 or 2 little pieces left to it. Most notably, everything was rotting, like it had been sitting there for decades rotting. The table was basically nothing, and I could see growth in what had been our floor, solid half tree growth. My only thought was, what the hell? And I rationalized that maybe someone found out about the fort and wrecked it. So I waited for the kids to come, and the next day, and the next day, and the day after that. I waited a week, and I never did see those kids again. I was pretty dejected, and eventually I stopped trying to wait for them. I wanted to look for them, but they never had shown up or told me where they lived, other than up the hill. My parents noticed and asked why I wasn't hanging out with the kids anymore, and I told them what was happening. They just dismissed it and insisted that if they didn't want to be my friend, then I didn't need them. I was sad for a good while after that. Cut to today. I am 29 and telling my wife about these kids I used to hang with, and this time we made a cool fort in the woods. I explain how they look and how they acted. It's overall a pretty good memory with a sad ending. My wife looks at me wide-eyed and just says, "You hung out with a bunch of spooky ghost kids?" I find this crazy, but she says, "Did anyone else see them?" And no, they didn't. They saw a flashlight, but never kids. They heard them and heard about them, but no one had ever laid their eyes on them other than me. There were never any records I could find about them. No one else in the school they supposedly went to knew them, and they never showed me their house, or came to mine, despite my insistence. My wife said that was some spooky stuff, and I should probably tell my story. In the late 1800s or early 1900s, there was a small pond on the outskirts of my town. Fed by streams, it provided a great fishing spot for kids and was also a popular swimming hole. But there was a hazard that was known by the adults. In the center of the pond, there was some form of deposit like quicksand that had turned the ground under the middle of the lake into a sticky goo that would trap anyone or anything foolish enough to step in it. As you can imagine, back then, much as it is now, children didn't always follow the rules. One day a group of kids were at the pond, swimming and having a good time. One child decided that he would show off and swam out to the middle of the pond. Naturally, he put his feet down and was immediately trapped by the gooey mud under the water. Now the mud had a bit of a suction effect, and the harder he tried to pull himself free, the deeper he sank into the mud. Realizing that he was in danger, he called out to his friends for rescue. Not thinking to run and get an adult, and knowing that their friend was in dire straits, the other children swam out to him and tried to pull him free. However, this had the expected result. They put their own feet into the mud to brace themselves and were trapped as well. It remains unknown how long the kids fought the mud, but after a while they were all pulled under the water and drowned. Fast forward 50 years. The streams that fed the pond had been redirected, causing the pond to dry up. It remained an unpopular place with locals, as it was known to be haunted ground. There was a mix of hauntings, both peaceful in the form of children playing and singing, and disturbing, like screaming. However, when Walmart decided to build a store in our town, all they saw were profits to be made. They eagerly bought the cheap property and built one of their supercenters. As one would expect, at first there was nothing wrong. The store ran normally, and everyone was able to shop in peace. It was the night crew that noticed something odd first. They would occasionally see flashes of light or hear the voices of children. Over time, this began to escalate until people were reporting hearing children during daytime hours as well. From there, the activity continued to increase. At the time of writing this, there have been items thrown, electronic toys activated, especially toys that sing, and objects have been levitated and moved around the store. I have witnessed these examples personally. Nothing thrown is ever an object that could hurt somebody, just bread and stuffed animals. And the moving items were usually something a customer was trying to reach but couldn't quite get. It's believed by most that the children do these things to keep people aware that they are there and to help as much as possible. There has never been a violent event involving these kids, and despite constant requests to do so, the Walmart management at all levels have refused to do any ghost haunts. Walmart official policy is that none of their stores are haunted, and they don't seem particularly interested in changing that stance. My friend, I'll call him John, worked at a hospital in Puerto Rico. The 5th floor of said hospital is mostly rooms converted into offices, so it could be assumed the people might have died there in the past. Multiple employees claim they've seen weird shit happen. John had the graveyard shift at one of those offices, and he was the only person in that whole area during the night. So one night he was sitting on his desk doing some paperwork when out of nowhere a printer, a big industrial, very loud one, just starts printing blank pages by itself. He thinks nothing of it, just stands up and walks to the printer and turns it off. About half an hour later he exits the office, and as he's walking away, after not more than maybe 10 steps, he hears the confirmation beep from the key code pad on the door. It's very quiet in that part of the floor at night. He walks back to check who got in and notices the door is ajar. So he thinks that's kind of weird and looks around. When he turns the corner, he sees sitting on the desk what he described to me as a black-haired white man wearing a typical office suit. He was just shuffling through some papers with a pencil, but this thing wasn't ghostly transparent or blurred. It was solid, like a person was there. Suddenly the room got very cold, and the figure started moving and slowly turned its head to look at John. When it faced him, he noticed this thing had a hole instead of a face. John immediately hauled ass and just ran for his life out of the office. After that, he quit his job and moved in for a while with his mother because he couldn't bear to be alone at night. I don't blame him. Whatever this thing was, it traumatized him. It's still hard for him to talk about it, and it's been a few years. Someone else had said that they worked there and that they had heard kids laughing at night. Yeah, I don't blame him for quitting. This happened about 7 years ago. I was 16 years old at the time and was home alone with only my younger sister, Nadine, who was 9 at the time. Our only parent was my mom. She worked a full-time graveyard shift, 10 to 7, and we had easily become accustomed to it because we were usually asleep or at school whenever she was working. Every night was the same. Get home from school, homework, shower, say bye to mom, and sleep. Often, me and my sister would stay up late despite my mother's orders, but nothing crazy ever happened. We lived in an upstairs two-bedroom apartment. At night, me and Nadine would barricade ourselves in our mother's room, lock the door, and sleep. We were always too scared to sleep in separate rooms. Our mother had the key to every door in the apartment. This specific night, me and Nadine were in the living room watching yet another Family Guy episode, and it was getting late, close to midnight, and we definitely had school the next day. As we were preparing for bed, someone knocked on the front door of the apartment. Now, this apartment complex had two doors, one metal door on the outside and then the door made out of wood, which was technically inside. Therefore, one would need to unlock two doors before they could get in. I looked at Nadine. Is Mom home early? I put my ear to the door. Then they knocked again. Who is it? I said through the door. No response. I ordered Nadine to call Mom. No answer. I looked through the peephole and I couldn't see anything. It was dark, and whoever it was wasn't tall enough to see even a silhouette. Before I could come up with a plan, whoever was on the outside of the door began pounding again. They were no longer knocking. It sounded like someone banging the door with a closed fist. As if on cue, Nadine and I ran to my mother's room and locked the door. Nadine began to cry. I tried to console her, but I was scared too. I waited a few moments in hopes that they would go away or my mom would call to yell at us to open the door. About 2 minutes passed and my mother called us back. She saw that we had called her and took a break as soon as she could. She was at work. I told her about the knocking and she urged us not to exaggerate. Whoever it was probably gone now and we were okay. She blamed it on perhaps a lone drunk or someone looking for trouble. Regardless, she said, do not open the door. She hung up and we got into bed. I was tossing and turning. It had been about an hour since the first knocking began, when suddenly, bang, bang, bang. Nadine and I shot up. The knocking was now at our bedroom door. There were no lights on in the apartment, which spooked me further. Who was in our home? I called my mom, and she answered on the first ring, and I nearly yelled at her, "They're knocking at the bedroom door." I was in tears, beyond scared. Nadine had hid in the closet. While my mom was on the phone, they pounded on the door again, and I extended my arm out with the phone in hand so she could hear. The pounding was so intense, I felt that at any moment they would break the lock on the door and rush in. She called 911 and came home that night. When she reached the front door, both doors were locked. The officers searched the home for any signs of entry, which wasn't likely since we were on the upstairs level. Nothing was ever found. Nadine and I still talk about this stuff because if it hadn't happened to both of us, I don't think anybody would believe us. I know I wouldn't. My entire life I lived in the same home. My grandfather built it in the 70s, and my mom remodeled it when she was pregnant with me. It's in Southern California, in a slow and mellow beach community founded in the 50s, so there's not a lot of paranormal stuff happening. The only peculiar thing while growing up was the man that whistled outside my bedroom window every night at exactly 7:43 p.m. I never thought anything of it, and by the time I was in middle school I basically used it to keep time. The whistle itself sounds like a man calling to a dog, a short and happy sort of sound. He whistled the same sound every night at the same time. It even stayed the same during daylight savings time. One night my mom was in my room with me, not a common occurrence as she had her own problems, and we didn't see each other often even when I was younger. I heard the whistle and promptly got up to go brush my teeth and wash my face like I did every night, and my mom reacted kind of odd. In retrospect, I can understand why. She was in the middle of saying something, and I just walked out of the room. She followed me and asked why I was getting ready for bed this early. Great parenting, Mom. And I just said, I heard the whistle. I'm not going to sleep yet, but it's time to get ready at least. I was younger, and that's how my mom tells it. She has a terrible memory, but she said that that's the only thing she can quote verbatim, besides the Pledge of Allegiance, because it was so unsettling. She hadn't heard me whistle. She didn't want to say anything, though, so she listened at the same time next night. She still heard nothing, but saw me walk to the bathroom and get ready for bed. She didn't tell me until I was 14 that she couldn't hear the whistle, so that I wouldn't be scared. Over time, I started to whistle with the man. I could imitate it perfectly, and I knew almost instinctively when to do it. It's like when you wake up to the same alarm at the same time so often that you couldn't sleep in even if you wanted to. I started to do this during my senior year, so I didn't really notice when the whistling got closer. I still don't know why, for sure, but I think it was because that's when I seriously started thinking about colleges. Late start, I know. During my senior year, there was some family drama, and I had to move back in with my father for a couple of months, and it seemed like something was missing. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't the whistling itself, but the feeling of being watched that always accompanied it. I had gotten so used to it that I didn't realize how uneasy it really made me feel. After I turned 18, I moved back into the house alone. My mom got arrested, not anything crazy, she was only gone for 4 months, and wanted me to stay and watch the house. This whole thing put me off school, so I spent most of my time either working or focusing on getting my GED. That's when shit started to get weird. I never thought of the man as a bad spirit in any sense. I had almost come to see him as my guardian angel. I made up a name for him, Gregory, and his dog, Socks. It was about January of this year, freshly 19 with a GED and big dreams of college, that I realized just how sinister things really were. Number 1. Only I could hear the whistle. The amount of sleepovers I had where I was the stupid one getting ready for bed too early definitely proves it. Number 2. It was only outside my window. If I were at any other spot in the house, I wouldn't hear it. And number 3. It had steadily moved closer to my window over the years. It used to be on the street. Before I realized it, it had crossed the grassy slope from the sidewalk to the brick foundation my house sat on. The night I applied for my new college, I got in, and I am transferring next fall, pray for me, I heard a tap. I've got some shitty friends and thick blinds, so I went over and swung them open fast to spook whatever asshat was trying to spook me, but I saw nothing. It was getting dark, and the sunset over the ocean was bright red. Unusual, but nothing to be alarmed about. What I saw in the sunset was what really terrified me. There he was, his head cocked to the side and just staring from the outside wall beside my large floor-to-ceiling window, only for a moment. It was almost like when something flashes on a screen for a tenth of a second and you kind of remember it, but you didn't have enough time to really process it. The face was pale. Not like a ghastly white, but pale, and his eyes were thin with age, but still intense. He had no facial hair, and his eyebrows were thick and wiry. When I blinked, I saw him like a brand on the back of my lids. I was shaken. The entire encounter felt like a warning. Why on God's green earth would the man that's been alongside me for so long try to hurt me? I almost felt betrayed. He had become the one constant, but now, when I look back on what I perceive to be a comforting caregiver, I'm only met with an uneasy stomach and the beginnings of a headache. This was the beginning. Every night he tapped on my window, and every night I jumped. I was still living alone, and I didn't want to call anyone about it. It was crazy, absolutely batshit bonkers, and I knew it. I felt isolated and alone, unable to go anywhere but the place I feared most. My friends had either moved away for college or were staying with their parents, so I couldn't ask them for help, and my family would lock me up. There's been a history of bipolar disorder in the family, and they shunned my mom for it. If I came forward talking about a ghost man that I named Gregory and his dog at my window, they would laugh. It seems funny from an outsider's perspective, really. I started taking the graveyard shift and going to shitty night classes that cost me more than they were worth. I stopped having friends over because, of course, they were going to hang at my place, where there was never anyone to bother our hooligan asses. I was so lonely for about 2 months I started having panic attacks when I would look outside at work to see the sun setting. One particular night it was so bad that my boss called after my concerned coworker contacted her and said that I needed to go home. It was the last thing I wanted, but this fear was making me physically sick, so I decided to grow some balls and stand in front of my open window at exactly 7:43. I stood there with chills up my back and waited. After moments of tense, staticky silence, I turned to look at the clock out of confusion. It was 7:45. There was nothing. No whistle, no tapping, and definitely no face. I felt triumphant. I was almost cocky when I really did nothing. I felt like I had conquered Gregory in socks. Just as I was coming down from the victory high, I heard what sounded like long nails on my hardwood floor. It almost sounded like my dogs, but I had put them in the backyard to do their business and neither of them were big enough to make that almost galloping sound. I couldn't see anything with my eyes, but I felt the fear of an animal running toward me at full speed. That hesitation between a heartbeat. I had nowhere to run, but I knew I had something to do. I had to get away. I could feel the ominous and dreary presence of the man coming from just outside the door inside my hallway, and the threat of the feral dog I knew was in front of me, but I just couldn't see. For a moment everything was quiet again, and I almost forgot how to breathe. I felt the presence leave. But then, right in my ear, clear as day, I hear, "I own you, Zoe." I could almost feel the breath rustle my hair. I broke down crying. I had never felt so helpless in my entire life. This thing that watched me grow and go through shitty puberty years and breakups and terrible family drama knew everything about me. I had let this dead man dictate my life for so long. He got in my head. I rented a shitty motel room for the next week with my pups. I don't recommend putting 2 dwarf pit bulls in a hotel room. And when I finally came back, the whistling was back on the street, but now it was accompanied by the sound of paws on concrete. This isn't a particularly terrifying story of skinwalkers or demons, but it haunts me to my core. I'm in this city that I'll call home in a couple of months to meet with leasing agents, but I'm going home tomorrow and I can feel that familiar sensation of what I can only describe as heartbreak and a loss of control seep back in. I don't want to go back. So currently my family is living with my mother-in-law. It's fine till we move in the next week or so. However, this house is really old. I mean, it's a farmhouse from the 1800s old. So, needless to say, I've experienced some weird shit here. The most recent was about a week ago. My 4-year-old decided she was going to stay awake until she couldn't take it anymore and came to my room to sleep. My husband works graveyard shifts, so he's not really bothering anyone. So I lay down with her and it takes a minute, but she finally falls asleep next to me. So about 20 minutes or so into her soundly asleep and snoring in my ear, I hear something. Now, I'm usually okay with noises. I've lived in some pretty haunted places before, and maybe I'm just a little too sensitive to this crap. However, I have never, not once, heard my own child's voice coming from anywhere that they weren't. I have 3 kids, mind you, and only one of them is a girl. Now keep in mind that my little girl is sleeping right next to me, snoring in my ear. There's no way in hell I should be hearing her voice outside my damn bedroom door, calling for me. "Mommy." Yeah, no. I grabbed my boys from their room and they had to sleep with me too, just in case. I'm fine with ghosts and shit, but don't start messing with my kids. So the next night my daughter decided she would take forever to put her sippy cup in the sink. So I told her that I was going to leave her downstairs if she didn't hurry up. She yelled at me and ran to me, saying she didn't want to go into the kitchen because of the girl. There are no females in this house aside from my mother-in-law, so there shouldn't be any other girls in the house. It's also nighttime, so what the fuck? I went into the kitchen to see what she was talking about, and there was no one there. But then she proceeds to tell me that the girl has gone to my nephew, which is weird. But we haven't had any experiences since, thankfully.